Well, I'm in San Diego and there's no hot tub here. So every once in a while I climb in the bathtub, but San Diego is short on water. They've stolen all the water possible from the Mexicans. And so I guess it's a sin to hang out in the bathtub. I mean, think of all the golf courses that could get watered if fewer of us would soak in the bathtub. So, anyway, so this morning I wanted to talk about the Vietnam War and veterans. Now, fortunately, this being, what is this? This is January. We're far enough past Veterans Day that I probably won't get lynched for this. Now, I think Mark Twain said something like, it ain't the stuff you don't know that causes trouble as much as the stuff you know that just ain't so. So, I put to your scrutiny some things I think I know, but maybe they just ain't so. Let us say that maybe half the things that I'm going to list below that I think I know just ain't so. But if half of them are, well, what then? As a nation and a culture, what do we do about celebrating the patriotism and sacrifice of our young people who went over to Vietnam to execute our will in an immoral endeavor? They were patriotic. They sacrificed. We must appreciate and celebrate that young people are willing to do that when we call on them. But what is the appropriate mix of celebration of them with shameful regret that we did that to them? So, among the things that I think I know, number one, during the Second World War, Ho Chi Minh was our ally, and we gave him arms and supplies to fight the Japanese. Now, during the war, number two, during the war, the Vichy French were allied with the Japanese, and they helped them steal rice from the Vietnamese, who then starved. At the end of the war, we gave rifles back to the Japanese soldiers to help us hold down the Vietnamese until we could give their country back to the French. Number four, the Vietnamese then began a war of independence against their colonial oppressors. Does that sound familiar? A war of independence against colonial oppressors. Now, similar to our own war of independence, the revolutionaries went to an opposing superpower for help. We, in 1776, we went to the French, who had a more oppressive and corrupt government than the one we were fighting against. The Vietnamese went to the Soviets. Who else could they go to? They didn't want to go to the Chinese. The Chinese are a little too close, a little too friendly. So once we got involved, we needed an excuse to get more involved. The American people didn't give a whit for some distant, unknown place in Southeast Asia. To quote President Lyndon Johnson, "We are not about to send American boys 9 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves." So the Gulf of Tonkin incident was manufactured. That's how we got into the Vietnam War, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and it was a total fabrication. But once fabricated and put before the always already bellicose American people, we were ready to fight. But Senator Wayne Morse, Democrat of Oregon, said, "I believe that this resolution will be a historic mistake. I believe that within the next century, future generations will look with dismay and great disappointment upon a Congress about to make a historic mistake." That's when they were going to vote on the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Okay, so number seven, then once we got into Vietnam, General Westmoreland attempted to win through attrition, meaning if we could kill enough revolutionaries, they'd give up. Instead, we killed more civilians than revolutionaries, which created anger and resentment, which created more revolutionaries. Another quote there, this one from Senator George McGovern. We seem bent upon saving the Vietnamese from Ho Chi Minh, even if we have to kill them and demolish their country to do it. You ever heard the phrase, we had to destroy the village to save it? I do not intend to remain silent in the face of what I regard as a policy of madness, which sooner or later will envelop my son and American youth by the millions for years to come. Senator McGovern. Another quote from Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense. There may be a limit beyond which many Americans and much of the world will not permit the United States to go. The picture of the world's greatest superpower killing or seriously injuring 1,000 non-combatants a week, per week, while trying to pound a tiny backward nation into submission on an issue whose merits are hotly disputed is not a pretty one. So number 8, the path to winning, becoming now the killing of revolutionaries, the success of the war, the success of the generals and the politicians came to depend on body counts. So everyone was then motivated to lie to us about how many revolutionaries got killed and how many innocent people weren't killed. Another quote from Henry Kissinger. I refuse to believe that a little fourth-rate power like North Vietnam does not have a breaking point. He charged his national security aides with developing a punitive military strategy that would coerce North Vietnam into negotiating on American terms. President Nixon said, "The bastards have never been bombed like they're going to be bombed this time." Now, Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson were all advised to not commit ground troops to Asia because American superiority in naval and aerial force could not be applied, and Asian manpower would overwhelm American manpower. In the American Revolution, Washington finally figured out he didn't have to win. In fact, he could not win. He only needed to not lose, to not give up. Eventually, the Brits got tired and they went home. The Vietnamese knew the same thing, and they did the same thing, and we did the same thing. We got tired and we went home. 10th point of things I think I know. Maybe they just ain't so, but I think they're true. There is no cultural nor physiological superiority of North Vietnamese or South Vietnamese, except that the North Vietnamese were determined to win. And the South Vietnamese, they could not be inspired, they could not be led, they could not be threatened to get in there and fight. The North was fighting a war of independence, and the South was fighting as a puppet of America. So I put it to you again, on Veterans Day, how do we combine our shameful regret with a celebration of patriotism and sacrifice? We no longer celebrate the sacrifice of Lee and Grant and Sherman in the Mexican-American War, which was a bald land grab from a weak neighbor. We no longer celebrate the sacrifices of Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War, another bald land grab instigated by another lie, the sinking of the USS Maine. The Spanish did not sink the USS Maine. The damage to the hull was an explosion outward. Its own ammunition blew up inside the ship. It wasn't blown inward like from a mine or a torpedo. So it does not take a savant to predict that the sacrifices in Vietnam are going to fall into the same obscurity as our memories of the sacrifices of those two wars. Nor does it take any special acuity to predict that if we continue to sacrifice to immoral adventures and adventures instigated by lies, then Veterans Day will someday show a lot less flags and a lot more barbecues and beer, just like Memorial Day, which was intended to celebrate the sacrifices of Union soldiers. Their sacrifices now slumber in obscurity.